Magnus Carlsen is widely considered the greatest chess player of all time. After all, he was the reigning world champion since 2013, until, for the first time, he decided to renounce his titles, declaring that he simply no longer had the motivation to defend them. Let's look at a game in which the young Magnus Carlsen was not yet world champion. Today, we are going to look at a game played by a very young Magnus Carlsen. At the time of this game, he was only 11 years old. And even then, he already knew how to surprise his opponents. The game was played in 2002 in Helsinki between Magnus Carlsen and international master Sampsa Nusti. Magnus Carlsen has the white pieces and opens the game with pawn to e4. Black responds symmetrically with pawn to e5. Knight to f3 follows, attacking the pawn on e5. Black defends with knight to c6, and Magnus continues development with knight to c3. Black replies with knight to f6, entering the four knights defense. Here, Magnus plays pawn to a3, preventing Black's bishop from developing to b4, but at the same time giving the move to his opponent. Black plays pawn to g6, with the idea of developing the dark squared bishop onto the long diagonal. In this position, the young and fearless Magnus decides to bring his knight forward very early in the opening. On just the fifth move, knight takes e5. White captures the pawn on e5, but sacrifices an entire knight. Black naturally accepts the gift and captures the knight. Pawn to d4 follows, attacking the knight and building initiative in the center. Black retreats the knight to c6, holding on to the material advantage. Magnus continues with pawn to d5, chasing the knight again, and the knight retreats all the way back to b8. Magnus then decides to send the second knight back as well. Pawn to e5 forces the knight on g8 to retreat. Both black knights have now returned to their original squares, while Magnus continues his aggressive play with pawn to d6. Black captures on d6, and pawn takes on d6. Now white has created a serious threat, queen to e2, after which the black king would have nowhere to go, forcing black to sacrifice a piece on e7 to block the check. Black responds with queen to f6, preparing to block the check with queen to e6 and exchange queens. Knight to b5 follows. Magnus keeps applying pressure, threatening a check on c7, which would win the rook on a8 due to a discovered attack on the king on e8. Black plays knight to a6, controlling the c7 square. Bishop to c4 follows, as Magnus develops his light-squared bishop and targets the e6 square. Now the threat of queen to e2 is even stronger, because black will no longer be able to block with the queen on e6. Black develops bishop to a6, planning to move the king to f8 after the check. Magnus plays queen to e2 with check, and the black king escapes to f8. Bishop to e3 follows as Magnus continues development. Black captures the bishop on e3, which is beneficial for black since exchanging pieces reduces white's attacking potential. Pawn from f takes on e3. With every move, Magnus creates new threats. Now white threatens rook to f1, and the pawn on f7 will inevitably fall. Black tries queen to h4 with check, but pawn to g3 easily blocks. Black plays queen to h5, attempting to exchange queens, but queen to f2 threatens mate in 1. Black blocks again with queen to f5, offering another queen trade. Magnus responds with queen to e2, once again threatening rook to f1. Black repeats with queen to h5, and Magnus plays queen to f2, followed by queen to f5 and queen to e2. At this point, Magnus was already satisfied with a draw and began repeating moves. This is understandable, as his opponent was far more experienced and had a higher rating at the time. But black chooses to continue playing. Knight to h6 is played, reinforcing the pawn on f7 so that after rook to f1, black can simply move the queen away. Magnus plays rook to f1. Black responds with queen to h5, again offering a queen exchange. However, queen to f2 breaks through on f7. Black blocks once more with queen to f5. Magnus plays queen to e2, and black responds with queen to e5. Black does not want to draw, and now eyes the pawn on b2. Magnus decides to play for a win. He castles long. Now the white king is completely safe and also defends the pawn on b2. Meanwhile, the black king begins to suffer. White now has a decisive advantage, which is easy to understand just by looking at the piece activity. White's bishop, rook, and queen are all attacking the black king, while black has only two pieces defending, the queen on e5 and the knight on h6. The rest of black's pieces are practically asleep. The rook on h8 does nothing. The bishop on c8 is blocked by its own pawns. The rook on a8 cannot enter the game. and the knight on a6 is completely passive. Black plays king to g7, breaking the pin on the f7 pawn. Magnus responds with rook to d5, attacking the queen and activating his second rook. Black plays queen to e8, and Magnus plays queen to d2, immediately noticing the weaknesses on the dark squares around the black king. Rook to f8. Black brings the rook into the defense of the king. Queen to d4 with check follows. Pawn to f6 blocks the check, and Magnus continues the attack with pawn to g4. Now white threatens a crushing move, pawn to g5, which would completely open the black king's position. Black plays pawn to b6, completely ignoring the threats. Magnus pushes pawn to g5. Knight to f5 follows, attacking the queen, but white simply captures the pawn on f6 with check, forcing black to recapture. Rook takes f5. Magnus sacrifices the exchange, taking advantage of the fact that the rook on f6 is pinned. Black captures the rook with the pawn, and then rook to g1 follows. Now 3 white pieces are attacking the black king, while black has only 2 pieces defending. The black king is now being finished off. White's pieces are literally tearing the position apart. Black's choice of moves is extremely limited. If black plays king to f8, there would be checkmate with the rook in one move. If black plays king to h8, the same one-move checkmate follows, but this time with the queen. The same fate awaits black after king to a6. Therefore, black has only one defensive option, to block with the queen on g6. Magnus gladly captures the opponent's queen, and after king takes g6, bishop to d5 follows, attacking the rook on a8. After rook to b8, pawn to e4 is played. Magnus continues to expose the black king. Bishop to d7 follows, as black tries to exchange white's active piece. White captures on f5 with check, and after rook takes f5, queen to g4 with check follows. The only move is king to f6, otherwise the rook is lost. King to f6, queen to h4 with check, king to g6, and bishop to c4. White does not exchange the bishop, but instead transfers it to d3, with the idea of pinning black's rook. Knight to c5 is played, controlling the d3 square, but pawn to b4 drives the defender away from d3. Knight to e4, knight to c7, and here black overlooks another powerful blow. Black captures on d6, but after queen to g3 with check, black resigns. It is a queen fork on the king and the knight. The game could have continued with king to f6, but then white simply captures the knight on d6, and after king to g5, another pawn falls. White's position is completely winning. That is why, after queen to g3, the more experienced Samsonusti resigns against the young Magnus Carlsen. If you enjoyed this game, do not forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my new content. Thank you for watching. You can also watch my video about the game of 13-year-old Magnus against world champion Garry Kasparov.